Hey everyone, welcome back for section 2.2. Today we're going to be talking about independence. So, kind of as an introduction to this, I want to kind of walk you guys through the timeline, do kind of a brief historical recap of the fight for independence. So, prior to 1760, not 1960. British colonial rule really was not burdensome to the colonists. The British flag flew peacefully over harbors. This one here is a painting of Newport, Rhode Island, and there were really no protests by the colonists. So at the time, colonists are really willing to accept colonial rule. I'm curious why you think that is. Like, what is going to change? What do you remember? You maybe haven't covered some of this stuff since like 8th grade, maybe. Um, so what do you remember? Why do you think that changes? All right. So I said 1760, right? So starting in 1761, the British start instituting some different policies that are going to have an impact on the colonists. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that the British were involved in wars like all over the world because the British, during this time, the saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire. They owned like everything, right? They owned Southeast Asia, they owned much of Africa, they have the colonies here in North America. And so all of those wars, all of that colonization is really expensive. And so the British need to figure out how are they going to pay for these things, right? And so they start instituting some different policies that are going to impact the colonists more and more as time goes on. So first we have the writs of assistance, which allowed British officials to search homes and businesses for smuggled goods. Colonization was definitely an economic choice for the British. And so if you were a colonist, a British colonist, then you were expected to buy your goods from the British. And so the writs of assistance said, hey, we can kind of spy on you, and if you're buying your goods from other people, we can do something about it, right? Proclamation of 1763 restricts white settlers from the land that's west of the Appalachian Mountains. And in addition, it required a license for trade with Native Americans. So the British kind of want to keep a close watch on the colonists, keep them nearby geographically, keep them trading with the British, right? 1764, we have the Sugar Act, which, just as it sounds, enforces taxes on sugar and other imported goods, followed by the Stamp Act, which now taxes printed paper, legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing gas, lead, paint, paper, tea. By this point, almost everything that the colonists use routinely in their day-to-day life has a tax on it. And the colonists really are frustrated with the fact that they are not represented in the decision to put these taxes into place. So they start kind of crying foul, right? The slogan in the colonies becomes no taxation without representation. 1773, you have the Tea Act, manipulates the tax on tea and basically gives the British East India Company a monopoly on tea. Our follow-up is the Boston Tea Party. Okay, now the British were so mad about the Boston Tea Party that they passed a number of other acts that like were supposed to keep colonists from organizing, from having town meetings, allowed British soldiers to be housed in private homes, more or less as spies. See who was disloyal to the British, right? In the colonies, we call these the intolerable acts. In Britain and England, they call them the coercive acts. So they think these policies are going to kind of force the colonists into being on their best behavior. That is not what's going to happen, right? So this crash course video does a great job of covering like everything that we're going to kind of walk through in the notes. So if you just want to Google it, or if you want to type in the link, it would be a great supplemental resource for you to kind of give you a refresher on the Revolutionary War period. So over time, we have growing colonial unity. Even really starting before the British passed all of these taxes, the colonists live in each other's communities, right? So they start to kind of form a bond, right? So starting in the late 1600s, the New England Confederation is the first military alliance. And it's not a military alliance to like fight the British, it's a military alliance to defend the colonists against Native American attacks. So that's the late 1600s, like 100 years before the Revolution. Okay. Then we have the Albany Plan. This happens in 1754, so again, our relationship with the British at the time, pretty solid, okay? But this was a meeting of the seven most northern colonies, and it was in place to discuss problems of colonial trade and again the danger of attacks from Native Americans. Ben Franklin suggested at this time that the 13 colonies meet annually, and at this Albany Plan, like convention more or less, they would have the power to raise military forces, to make war and peace, specifically with like the Native Americans again, and then the power to regulate trade, tax, and collect customs, which is tax on imports, so on and so forth. So they start to kind of organize themselves politically to some degree. And then we have the Stamp Act Congress. So just as it sounds, this alliance forms itself following the Stamp Act, which was passed in 1765, which had placed a tax on all legal documents, business agreements, and newspapers. The phrase here becomes taxation without representation. So 9 colonies send representatives to New York, and they write what's called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And in this declaration, they basically write out to the king, these are all of the things that we're upset about. Do something to fix it, right? The king doesn't respond, goes unanswered. Then this is followed by the Boston Massacre, the Committees of Correspondence, which is another sort of organization, and eventually the Boston Tea Party. All right, so after we have the Boston Tea Party, as I mentioned, the British passed those coercive acts, or the intolerable acts as the colonists called them. And so in response to those, the colonists call the First Continental Congress, which was just a meeting of delegates from the different colonies. Delegates is just another term for representatives, to discuss what they were going to do about the intolerable acts. So 12 of the 13 colonies show up. Rhode Island is the like one that doesn't show up to any of this stuff most of the time. And they meet from September to October of 1774 in Philadelphia. And this is really the first time that the colonists formally unite to oppose the British crown. And they agree to meet again in the future here. So then we have the Second Continental Congress. And again, we have a convention of delegates or representatives who get together to manage the war effort and really make a formal move towards independence. At one point or another, all 13 colonies are involved in this process, and this Second Continental Congress is an ongoing group that meets between the spring of 1775 through July of 1778 in Philadelphia. They are the group that formally adopts and writes the Declaration of Independence, therefore kind of declaring war against Great Britain. And then they are the group that manages the war effort throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. So one of the first motions that's made is made by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. And basically this is just the formal move towards independence. He says that these united colonies have the right to be independent and free states, and that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, all political connection, so on and so forth. So then, once this is passed in June of 1776, they need to put this together as a formal declaration to really let the British know that, hey, we're not part of you anymore, okay? So we call that the Declaration of Independence. The author of the Declaration of Independence is Thomas Jefferson. Him, along with four others, are tasked with preparing a proclamation of independence. Thomas Jefferson was young, he was quiet, shy, but he was well respected amongst the delegates. He was also from Virginia, which was important because Virginia is such a powerful state politically at the time, and so that's kind of everything kind of has an ode to Virginia. Okay, get their people on board. In the Declaration itself, Thomas Jefferson dang near plagiarizes some of John Locke's ideas, right? He talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? When John Locke talked about life, liberty, and property, so on and so forth. So Lee's resolution calling for independence is passed on July 2nd. Thomas Jefferson is charged with writing the Declaration, and he gets it done by July 4th. So pretty quick, right? And this declaration is written on July 4th of 1776, and really it outlines the reasons that the colonists decided to declare independence. So how's the Declaration reflect colonists' dissatisfaction with the British government? The Declaration we can kind of break up into a few different segments. So first we have like the preamble, which is more or less the introduction. Hey, we're just writing to say we're declaring independence, right? And then we have like this whole section on like philosophy about what government should be. Government should be a social contract instituted among men to protect the natural rights of its citizens, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so on and so forth. So we have this like paragraph that's like a philosophical discussion of what the colonists believe government should be. And then the bulk of the Declaration of Independence are grievances. So what are our problems we have specifically with the king? He has violated our rights. He has not responded to our complaints, so on and so forth. He has placed soldiers in our homes. Just like grievance after grievance, these are all the things that we don't like about you, right? And then it's summed up with this resolution of independence. This is what we're going to do about it. The British really see this as a declaration of war, right? For us, we call it a Declaration of Independence, and this is the official start to the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War is going to go on for about 5 years, and then we get to the business of actually creating a government. And that's where things get even more difficult, and that's what we're going to pick up on in the next section. Have a good rest of your day.